Welcome to the Gold Coast North Anglican Church podcast. We're a vibrant church on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. Our worship styles are traditional through to modern, and we have families through to seniors. Our mission is to spread the good news of Jesus Christ throughout Australia and the rest of the world, and to encourage everyone who encounters us to reach their potential in Jesus Christ. Our podcast today is looking at our Kingdom Come series, which takes a tour through Matthew's Gospel, looking at God's kingdom here on earth.
I don't know if you've ever had that experience when you go to the doctors where your doctor is running late. I know it's a very rare occurrence for a doctor to be running late. Little joke there. Love our doctors. I think they do wonderful jobs and appreciate that sometimes appointments can run over as different medical needs pop up. And so you kind of know, don't you, when you go to the doctors, you know, if you end up going in on time or a few minutes early, fantastic. It's amazing. Even a few minutes late, fantastic. But often, you know, you're probably going to be delayed in some way. I was pretty lucky the other day. I went to the doctor and basically he got me straight in. It was an early morning appointment, so I was pretty stoked about that. Often, though, when we're waiting, you know, sometimes, particularly when it's really long, I don't know about you, I start to find myself getting impatient and starting to wonder what's going on. And then, you know, I sort of go up to the receptionist and say, hey, look, just wondering how many more patients, and sometimes you're next, or, oh, look, actually there's another 3 before you, and Now, one of the little dilemmas that pops up, I don't know if you've ever had this, is when you need to go to the toilet. And you're there going, gosh, what do? Do I stay? Do I quickly pop out? What if they call me, you know, while I'm out? Do I miss my spot? Will I be delayed? Will I be put to the end of the queue? Maybe that's just me that worries about these things. But it's funny, isn't it? Because if you know there's going to be a delay, you would probably prepare for it, wouldn't you? You would probably make sure you don't drink too much liquids. You'd make sure you go to the toilet beforehand. So that way you've kind of prepared and ready, so that when your time to see the doctor arrives, you're ready to go. Today we are looking at Matthew's Gospel passage where Jesus tells a story about being ready, kingdom ready. And so we're in week 4 of our sermon series called Kingdom Come. And we're exploring the idea of God's kingdom. And I keep saying idea, but it's the reality. For Christians, it's a reality that God's kingdom has broken into this world, where God rules and reigns in our hearts and seeks to lead us to do kingdom works of love and grace and mercy, to be, as the Beatitudes point out to us, to be peace builders, to people who try and build up right relationship between people and God. And so the big idea is that if you've put your faith in Christ and have been baptized, you become part of something bigger. You become part of God's kingdom. You're part of something so huge that goes back through time and will go forward through time. Jesus is your king. And I guess Christians have the bold claim that we're on the winning side, that Jesus has won the victory over sin and death, and one day he will return. We get a kingdom family, brothers and sisters in Christ, who we can journey with. We get a kingdom hope, knowing that this world isn't all that there is, but we're called ultimately to the banquet in the kingdom with Christ, and to be in God's loving presence. And we have a kingdom purpose. It doesn't matter who you are, what age or stage of life, what your capabilities are, whether you've got a lot or a little, you matter because you have a kingdom purpose. You can get out there and love people in God's name. And so our passage today encourages us to be kingdom ready. And so, as I've just read, it's a passage where Jesus is telling a story about what the kingdom was like. He does lots of parables. And you find in Matthew's Gospel there are 5 sort of big teaching blocks of Jesus. And in some ways, commentators point to the fact that kind of seems to echo Moses, and that Christ is the new Moses, because the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, are attributed to Moses within the tradition. And so Jesus in some ways is the new Moses. And it's interesting, the teaching blocks go from kind of what does the kingdom mean for you and I at an individual level, and how we are to live and relate to each other, but then they kind of get increasingly challenging and difficult. And towards the end it starts to become more and more about what's called apocalyptic, the sense of when Christ will return. because there's this sense that we're in an in-between time with the kingdom. Jesus inaugurated the kingdom, kicked the kingdom off, got it going, but it's not yet finished. And we're to play our part in helping grow this kingdom of love and grace until Jesus returns. And so we say it in the creeds, the Nicene and the Apostles' creeds. There's reference to that Christ will return as king and as judge. And so we see that Jesus in the preceding chapter talks about the temple's going to be destroyed. There's going to be persecution happen. In fact, in 66 AD, I think it is, some 30 or so years after Christ, the Romans did actually come in and sort of destroy the temple after the Israelites tried to kind of have a bit of an uprising. The Romans came in and quashed it pretty severely. But then he also talks about a further time horizon about when he's going to return, when the Son of Man will come. And it's interesting, just a little kind of side tip, and no disrespects, but there's often people who pop up throughout the ages trying to predict the end of the world. And they look at the Bible and they try and measure things out, and so far none of them have been correct. And Jesus actually says no one knows but God. Verse 36 of chapter 24, but about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. So we don't need to get too obsessed about that sort of stuff. We just got to get on with the kingdom work until either Jesus returns or he calls us home, and we leave this earth. And so he then tells the story about how we're to conduct ourselves while we're waiting. And so there's the parable of the unfaithful slave who misuses the resources and the position that he finds himself in, and is severely judged for that. And then we see this parable of the 10 bridesmaids about being ready. And it's all to reinforce we don't know when Christ will return, as it were. And so, look, this is a pretty tricky passage. I've done a lot of reading during the week. And one of the challenges is trying to understand weddings in first century Palestine or Israel. And so every country has different kind of traditions around weddings. All different cultures have different traditions around weddings. I went to a friend's wedding many years ago, and he was Vietnamese, and so there was all different kind of. It was a Christian wedding in the Catholic tradition, but there was a bunch of things that happened that reflected the Vietnamese culture, very different to, I guess, the Anglo expression of weddings that I had encountered in my own family and elsewhere. We also see these different expressions happen across even similar cultures. And I know in America they have very different ways of doing weddings than, say, the UK versus here in Australia. My cousin was married a year or so ago, and that was in India. And so again, just seeing the photos and the footage, very different practices. And so it can be hard to get our head around this sort of passage if we're just projecting or just sort of using our own experiences of weddings as the reference base. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a manual on what happened in these weddings back in the day. So people much smarter than I have tried to reconstruct things as best they can, but there's still a few gaps. But the sense we get is that the bride would be waiting at her house, and then the bridegroom would come to her, and that they would most likely be married then, or maybe married on the way, and then there would be a procession through the village or the town to the bridegroom's house, and that's where the reception essentially was going to happen. And so the weddings, I read in one commentary that suggested that weddings occurred on a Wednesday evening. And so weddings were often in the evening. The marriage would happen, there'd be the procession through town, and then there'd be the big festivities at the bridegroom's house. And so an important part of the procession was light, having torchbearers, people to illuminate the way, and it'd be quite a festive and celebratory event. And so the bridesmaids, the attendants, obviously part of their role was to have these torches or lamps and would guide the way. And so interestingly, if you think of kind of like Aladdin's lamp and those sort of clay lamps, some suggest maybe that was the kind of lamp. But others, quite a few, suggest that maybe it was sort of a torch where basically you'd have a stick and you'd have rags soaked in olive oil, and they would be wrapped around, and so you'd need to tend to them, keep them kind of wet enough to burn, but not too wet that they couldn't burn, and you needed spare oil. And so you needed to be prepared, so that way the procession would go well. You didn't want the procession going out halfway through. And again, we kind of, I think, forget how much artificial light we have in the evenings, with electricity and street lights and so on and so forth. It would have been very dark, and so this would have been a very critical role. And so Jesus tells this story about a wedding. And so these bridesmaids take their lamps and go to meet the bridegroom. So maybe they're waiting outside the bride's house. Interestingly, the bride's not mentioned, but that's not the focus of the story. Jesus is shaping it to make a particular point about being ready. And so they're there and they're waiting, and we see that there are 10. 5 are called foolish because they don't take any oil with them. They don't think ahead, they're not prepared. And 5 do, and they're called wise. And Matthew talks a bit about, or emphasises when Jesus talks about the wise versus the foolish. And so they're there waiting. And so the bridegroom's delayed, no reason given. All of them became drowsy and slept. And there's no kind of sense of condemnation that they got drowsy and slept. That, you know, they're there, they're waiting. And the bridegroom's delayed. They're probably also having a bit of a kip. And then we hear that at midnight, verse 6, there was a shout. Now again, there's some conjecture whether it was midnight, whether it was late in the evening. Either way, it's pretty dark. And for some reason, there's someone on watch who can see the bridegroom coming from far away. And so they shout and, hey, let's go. The bridegroom's coming. Let's get ready to meet him. Let's get this party started. And so they get up and they start trimming their lamps. They start getting things ready. And the foolish say to the wise, hey, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. And in fact, the Greek seems to suggest that, they're trying to light them, and as they're burning, they're kind of sputtering out pretty much immediately. And the wise reply, no, there will not be enough for you and for us, which often seems harsh. You think, surely the Christian thing to do is to share the oil. And we'll get back to that in a sec. And they say, go to the dealers, buy some for yourself. And so I don't think the dealers probably would have been open, but my lights have just gone out. I don't think the dealers would have been open, but what I think would have happened is they probably, small village, they would have known who the people who sold oil were. They would have banged on the door, hey, can you help us out? We've got a bit of an emergency. And so off they go. And then while they're off, the bridegroom arrives and the procession starts, and the wise bridesmaids go in with the bridegroom into the festivities. And so eventually the foolish bridesmaids turn up. They finally got their oil. They're all organised. And they knock on the door and suddenly it says, the reply is, truly, I do not know you. It's quite a challenging parable. In many ways, the parables kind of take on types. The different elements represent different things. And so in many ways, the bridegroom is Christ. And Jesus is, in the context of what we've been looking at from chapter 24, Jesus is talking about being ready. That when he comes back, you need to be ready. And so Christ as the bridegroom has been delayed. We don't quite know when. The early Christians would have been waiting and expecting Christ to turn up pretty much immediately. And here we are a couple of thousand years later, and Jesus is saying, you just got to be ready. No one knows when I'll return. And so it's interesting, often we look at the wise bridesmaids being quite harsh, going, why wouldn't they share? Surely the Christian thing to do, the charitable thing to do would have been to share. But that kind of misses the point of the procession. It would have been, and misses the point of the focus. It's often in our culture, the bride is the centre of attention at a wedding. There's a real focus on the dress and what they wear and the makeup, and really the bride is kind of held aloft, you might say. Everyone knows the guy's going to be wearing some sort of suit or something, but we want to see what the bride looks like. It was actually the reverse from what I can gather in the culture of Jesus' day. The centre of attention was the bridegroom. And so the whole point of the procession was to illuminate the bridegroom. There's a ring of truth to that, isn't there? Because as the church, we're here to illuminate Christ. We're here to shine the light brightly on him so others might look to him and find hope in him, receive forgiveness through him. And so it's not that these wise bridesmaids were being uncharitable or unchristian. They were being focused on their role, which was to illuminate Christ, and they were prepared and ready to do it. And the foolish bridesmaids should have known that that was their role and should have been prepared, but they weren't. And so in the end, they're locked out. And we see that motif a number of times through the Gospels, people ultimately not being able to enter into the kingdom reality. They've excluded themselves somehow. And so what does it mean for us? Well, I think what it means for us is that we've got to make sure that we own our own faith and we tend to our faith. It could be argued that maybe the foolish bridesmaids just assumed that, hey, look, I can turn up. I've been invited. I'm part of the bride's family. I'll just be welcomed in. But they've never actually properly received the invitation. They've never understood it, and they've never made the steps to start changing their lives ready for that moment. Some people grow up in and around the Christian faith, but never really receive it and own it themselves. And so the invitation is to own your faith. Have you really received Christ's forgiveness? Have you put your trust in him? Have you declared him as your king, as it were, so that you can enter in and become part of the kingdom? Second, though, is to tend to our faith. It's no good burning brightly for a season and then fading away. It's no good not reinvesting in our faith each and every day, and then suddenly you sort of drift away and then, okay, yeah, God, maybe Jesus, yeah, it was kind of a phase or a fad. We're called to tend to our faith. And that means to kind of, I guess, make sure we've got enough oil. And we've got to let God be the source to fill us up. And so what does it look like? Well, we encourage people here to have daily God time. That on the progression of discipleship, we want you to encounter God through worship. And then we want you to go deeper through spending time with God each day. And there's a myriad of Bible apps that has short little plans through to whole Bible reading plans. There's a whole bunch of printed materials. There's so many resources that don't have to take a lot of time, that you can spend time with God each day. Two stories to kind of highlight this. One is a chap in one of our churches who downloaded a Bible app that we suggested. I think we've got links on our website to it. And so it tracks kind of how many days in a row you've done it. And every once in a while he says, hey, I'm up to 200, I'm up to 400, I'm up to 500. And so he's really stoked by that. But then I kind of dig a little deeper. I say, and is it making a difference? And he says, yeah, absolutely. It's so good. He's so glad that he's doing that. Spending a little bit of time each day with Christ and being filled, tending to his faith. Personally, I kind of ebb and flow with my habits, but I know just before I went away on leave a number of weeks ago, I was getting really tired. And on the holidays, I was able to spend some time really getting back into some intentional habits of just being still, pausing, praying, reading the Bible, and being filled. And so now at a point, now that I'm back into the busyness of ministry, I'm finding that when that temptation comes to sort of get started with all the jobs that have to be done, I find myself going, no, it's more important to be filled up and to be calmed by the presence of Christ, so I can then get on with my day, rather than just rushing straight to pouring out and doing everything that needs to be done. And so I want to encourage you to be kingdom ready, to be ready to be able to shine Christ's light as you go out each and every day, to shine a light on Christ through acts of love and service as you bless others. But to be able to pour out like that as you go out in the world, to shine that light on Christ, you've got to be filled up. And so we encourage you to go deeper, spend time each day with Christ. For me, the first thing I do when I wake up, I'm now in the habit of saying, good morning, Jesus, good morning, God. I turn to my little Bible app and there's a verse of the day. I read that verse and I just spend a minute in prayer. And then a little later, when I kind of have done the busyness of the morning routine and kids and school runs and so on, I then spend a deeper intentional amount of time. And so it is possible So I encourage you, go deeper so that you might shine the light of Christ brightly, and so that all the world would know his name and would know forgiveness and be able to enter into the kingdom through him.
Thanks for joining us for the Gold Coast North Anglican Church podcast. I invite you to like us, follow us, subscribe to our podcast so that way you don't miss out on any episodes. If you want to know more about Gold Coast North Anglican Church, then head over to our website. The address is goldcoastnorth.org.au, and there you can find out all about our church. I also encourage you to engage with us on Facebook. We would love to pray with you and connect with you. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. God bless.